Blake Lively's lawsuit drama with Justin Baldoni continues to rage on, and things do not appear to be slowing down anytime soon. On February 18th, Blake Lively's legal team filed an amended complaint against Baldoni and the other Wayfarer parties. She makes a number of changes, including adding some parties and some causes of action, and she changes what she alleges about some of the events that occurred on set. And while in some respects these changes are probably fine for this case, I want to talk about why I think overall it probably still wasn't a great idea to amend this complaint in this way. And I want to talk about why I think if this ultimately goes to trial, there are ways in which this can all blow up in Lively's face. Let's get into it. Okay, so if you are unfamiliar with this case, I have a whole playlist of videos that I have made on the topic so far, starting with the background of this case in my first video. So if you want to know more about the background and kind of where we got to this point so far, be sure to follow the link in the description below to the playlist so you can get caught up. Also, I have mentioned this before, but it does take some time to put these videos together. So if you want to see more of my thoughts more in real time, be sure to follow me on X at Legalbytes Media, and you can see more there. Okay, with that out of the way, let's talk about this amended complaint. As Justin Baldoni did before her, Blake Lively recently, just last week, filed a First Amended Complaint. This was highly anticipated since her lawyers recently told the court that they were planning to amend their complaint to add parties and claims because of, quote, new facts and claims that they learned since filing their original complaint. Now, let me first get out front that there are actually some claims that Lively has made that Baldoni and the Wayfarer parties might need to be concerned about. I won't get too deep into the weeds on that specifically in this video, but I do want to mention that Lively's strongest claims in her lawsuit are quite possibly the retaliation claim and the failure to investigate claim. Of course, as is the case with every lawsuit out there, it comes down to what the evidence actually shows, but based on her allegations, it looks to me like these are likely her strongest ones at the moment. Part of that has to do with just how easy or difficult these various claims are to prove. So if you are interested in getting all of those details, let me know in the comments down below, because if there is enough interest, I can put out another video focusing on what Baldoni might potentially need to worry about in Lively's lawsuit. Otherwise, let's talk about the parts of Lively's amended complaint that actually might end up hurting her in the end. So right off the bat, one of the biggest changes in Lively's amended complaint is an added claim of defamation against Baldoni, Heath, and Wayfarer. There are a handful of statements that she highlights in the amended complaint which she says are defamatory. All of these statements were made to the press by Baldoni's and Heath's and Wayfarer's attorney, Brian Friedman. Now, as we all know, Friedman has been vigorously representing Baldoni and the others in the court of public opinion, and he's been pretty aggressive with his statements to the point that Lively's attorneys tried getting the court to put a gag order on him. When that didn't work because the court refused to grant the gag order, they instead added these statements to their lawsuit and added claims of defamation. If you watched the Johnny Depp v. Amber Heard trial in 2022, you might recognize this strategy since that was also the basis for Heard's defamation claim against Depp. Depp's lawyer, Adam Waldman, had made statements to the press about Heard's allegations, and so when Depp sued Heard for defamation over her claims that he abused her, Heard then countersued on the basis of Waldman's statements made on behalf of Depp to the press. And so that's essentially what's happening here. Lively is claiming that Friedman lied about her in these various statements that he made on behalf of Baldoni and Heath and Wayfarer, and so she is suing them for defamation. But here's why I think this was maybe a mistake. Remember, in order to prove defamation over these statements, Lively needs to show basically that Friedman lied about her to the press on Baldoni's behalf, that he did so with actual malice, and that she was harmed reputationally as a result, so financially, in her profession, etc. The statements that she points to are where Friedman said things like the following: "It is shameful that Miss Lively and her representatives would make such serious and categorically false accusations against Mr. Baldoni, Wayfarer Studios, and its representatives. Blake and her legal team have just one heinous pivot left, and that is to double down on the revoltingly false sexual allegations against Mr. Baldoni. We will not only continue to defend our clients against Blake's power, privilege, and all-out lies, but we will now fight even harder for the voiceless in the DV community who are unfairly suffering while she continues to push on her own self-serving and selfish vendetta in the media. There was no sexual harassment. And finally, the concern really is that she used these allegations of sexual harassment and she used these allegations of bullying to try and leverage her position so she could be the de facto director in the case." And now Baldoni's side is, of course, going to be coming back with arguments saying that this isn't defamation. For example, they'll probably argue that some or even all of these are permissible opinion statements that cannot be the basis for a defamation claim. But even without getting too deep into an analysis of whether these statements are indeed defamatory and how likely it is for Lively to win for these specific statements, there is a big reason why I think this was a huge mistake for Lively that doesn't even have to do with that analysis. You see, all of these things that Friedman is alleged to have said to the press are all things that Baldoni was going to need to prove. He's going to have the burden of proving all of these things in his lawsuit against Lively. For example, did Lively actually try to use a sexual harassment claim to extort his movie from him? That's one of his causes of action, is extortion, and that's the basis for that claim. And again, did Blake Lively use her power and her privilege against him during production and to the press afterwards? Like I said, the burden is on him to prove these things in his lawsuit. And in that lawsuit, he still has that burden. But now that Lively has added her claim of defamation for each of these statements, she now also has the burden of proving that each statement is actually a lie. So, for example, she needs to prove that she never used sexual harassment allegations or bullying allegations to leverage her position to become the de facto director in the case. And the question is, can she adequately prove that? Or rather, can she adequately disprove that that's something that happened? Can she prove that she wasn't pushing a self-serving and selfish vendetta in the media with respect to her sexual harassment allegations? You see, by bringing this defamation claim, she is bringing the burden of proving all of these things onto herself. And this is at a time where so far it's looked like the receipts that have been available have been much more helpful to Baldoni than they have been to Lively, and particularly as they relate to the sexual harassment claim. And because this case is just as much a lawsuit in the court of public opinion as it is in the court of law, we also cannot ignore the impact that this will have on public discourse about the case. Going back to December, it appears that Lively made these allegations publicly in order to cast a particular light on Baldoni and the others, whether rightfully or wrongfully. But what has happened so far, by and large, is that in the court of public opinion, this really has backfired. And as a result, people are really scrutinizing Blake Lively. Now, there are those who say that this is par for the course for women who come forward with allegations of sexual harassment and sexual abuse. This was a common refrain by supporters of Amber Heard, for example. However, the way that I personally see these things is this really is because social media likes to dig into the receipts to see if they add up. And if they don't, and particularly if they don't add up to the way that legacy media or traditional media has made things out to appear in a certain way, social media can be absolutely ruthless. So PR-wise, if Lively is now trying to shift the narrative away from having to defend her own actions and push that back onto Baldoni to have to explain himself, this is not the right strategy, because now she has to dig into the details herself and provide proof to a potential jury that she's not a bully, that she's not a mean girl, that she didn't try to perform a hostile takeover of Baldoni's movie, etc. This means she's inviting more focus onto what she did as opposed to what Baldoni did. And PR-wise, like I said, this may end up being a much bigger problem for Lively than what she anticipated, given what we've already seen from various interviews that she's done over the years and from the receipts that have actually come out, where ultimately, so far, she's not looking good. Okay, so that's the defamation claim. Another thing that Lively brings more into focus in the amended complaint is the allegation that there were other actresses on set who made complaints about Baldoni and about Heath, about things that they did that made them uncomfortable. I will say, for me personally, it is a little bit of a red flag when I see that Lively didn't name who these women are, and that she didn't go into much more detail about what these specific complaints were and what the context of these complaints were, other than to say that these women were uncomfortable and that they made complaints in one way or another. Now, when it comes to discomfort, there are some forms of discomfort that are unlawful. There are also other forms of discomfort that are not unlawful. As an example, if an employee gets completely raked over the coals by their boss because they showed pure incompetence at their job and it ended up costing the company money, or it harmed clients or something like that, understandably, that employee would feel a little bit uncomfortable in the moment. But that discomfort most likely is not unlawful. However, then there is, of course, discomfort that includes things like sexual harassment, which would likely be unlawful. So when the amended complaint talks about these women being uncomfortable, we really don't know what that means. And when it comes to any legal complaint, any legal argument really, you're generally speaking going to use the strongest language that you can in order to make your case. And this is especially true when you know that your legal complaint or your filing or your argument, what have you, is going to be picked apart and digested by the public, which is hungry for all of the details of this case. And in the days after Lively filed her amended complaint, The Hollywood Reporter came out with an article about the case, focusing largely on his adherence to the Baha'i faith. But in the article, it also referenced Lively's allegation that other women were made uncomfortable by Baldoni's or Heath's behavior on set. And so here we have an idea of maybe what at least one of these alleged incidents was all about, because it talks about a complaint made by the actress Jenny Slate. Specifically, it says Slate complained about Jamey Heath from an interaction she had with him about her housing. Now, this of course depends on the version of the article that we're talking about too. There have apparently been a number of revisions of this article at this point where The Hollywood Reporter said Slate either complained to Sony or she didn't complain to Sony, but then word got back to Sony and then Sony mentioned the complaint to Wayfarer, etc. Now, these details are important for this particular lawsuit because we are also talking about allegations like a failure to investigate when complaints are made that are potentially unlawful employment practices. So whether Wayfarer knew about certain complaints, who made these complaints, what they were actually about, what was actually said in these complaints, how it was communicated to them, all of these details are potentially important. But you don't even actually have to go that granular to see why this is a potential problem for Lively to try to use this kerfuffle, if you want to call it that, for support for her own allegations. So let's take a closer look here. According to the article, Slate said she wasn't happy about the apartment she rented during production for herself and her toddler, but she was reluctant to move because if she did, she would lose her $15,000 security deposit. Jamey Heath, the co-producer, apparently responded that they would pay for her deposit so she could move to a new apartment. But when he did, he reportedly used language that she found, wait for it, uncomfortable. Specifically, she apparently said he focused intensely on the sanctity of motherhood and Slate's role as a mother. According to the article, he says he has a different understanding of their interaction. But regardless, if this is one of the uncomfortable interactions that Lively was alleging in her complaint, referring to using as foundation for her sexual harassment allegations, this doesn't sound like the kind of thing that we were expecting in the context of this lawsuit. If the thing that was making Jenny Slate uncomfortable about this whole interaction was statements about the sanctity of motherhood, that sounds like what made her uncomfortable was something with a religious overtone, not so much a sexual one. So even if Slate had genuine concerns and she genuinely and sincerely was weirded out by the language that Heath used, that could absolutely be the case. This still may end up being a problem for Lively's allegations if she's trying to use it as support for her own claims. For one thing, like I said, when we're talking about sexual harassment claims, we are talking about behavior that we expect to be more like base and lustful. Now, can that kind of behavior come from someone who also speaks in a flowery or religious or spiritual kind of way? Yes, of course. Plenty of allegations have come out from various religious organizations about religious leaders. But in the context of this particular lawsuit, the jury might look at this situation and say, if Heath is being like super woo-woo and spiritual about motherhood, this seems to suggest the opposite of creepy, lustful, and base behavior. And so Lively kind of needs to bridge this gap here to show how this really relates at all to any of her sexual harassment claims, because it otherwise can completely backfire with the jury if she doesn't successfully do that. And the thing is, she has also created this expectation in the First Amended Complaint that these other women have made sexual harassment complaints like hers. And the way that the public is currently reacting to the expectations that she sets here in the First Amended Complaint and how she's able to either meet or not meet those expectations, that can really mimic the way that a jury might end up seeing the same. In other words, if this goes to trial and Lively's attorneys tell the jury, hey, get a load of this. Lively is not the only one that made these complaints. She's not the only one that was made uncomfortable by these creeps. These other women will say me too. And then if in that kind of a situation, this is what they show the jury as their proof of behavior that made people uncomfortable, the jury might then look at Lively's attorneys and go like, what are you even talking about? To use filmmaking terms, it looks a bit like a setup with no payoff. This is where a movie introduces a narrative element that suggests importance but ends up leading nowhere. Or if you want maybe a more vivid illustration, you could say it's all retch and no vomit. And when a party sets up a particularly powerful expectation for the jury that they then fail to meet, the jury oftentimes will start to really discount what that side has to say. And that brings me to my final point in this video, where I think that Lively may have gone wrong in her amended complaint. And this has to do with her essentially changing her allegations about what she says Baldoni did while filming that infamous slow dance scene. If you've been following this channel's coverage of this lawsuit, you know that I did a video about that specific allegation a while ago. In fact, it was my first video on it. Lively alleged initially that Baldoni basically improvised the scene while filming and without an intimacy coordinator. And she basically made it seem like she was trying to act in a scene according to what they were supposed to be doing, but he kept breaking character and he kept talking when they weren't supposed to be talking, and he essentially was using this scene as an excuse to get intimate with her while the cameras were rolling. And then, as you may know, Baldoni released the footage of this scene, the raw footage of it, at least 10 minutes worth. And this footage really showed that really Baldoni was responding to what Lively was doing. She appeared to be the first to break character. She appeared to be the one insisting on talking when he had no talking in mind for the scene, and she appeared to be the one to start referencing her relationship with Ryan Reynolds while filming the scene. So it really didn't fit with the way that she portrayed the scene in her complaint. There just were a number of inconsistencies. So now in the amended complaint, she turned what once was like a short single paragraph description of this whole scene into a much longer allegation. It goes into way more detail about it, and it kind of bends what she alleges about the scene to what the video shows. As an example, in the complaint, she alleged that they were filming a montage scene where no sound was recorded. After the footage came out and everyone could see that there was in fact sound recorded and that it picked up their entire conversation, she then changed her amended complaint to say that music was intended to play over the action. Nonetheless, microphones were live to pick up the room tone, but not conversations or dialogue to be used in the film. As another example, in the complaint, Lively said, Mr. Baldoni chose to let the camera roll and have them perform the scene, but did not act in character as Ryle. Instead, he spoke to Miss Lively out of character as himself. At one point, he leaned forward and slowly dragged his lips from her ear and down her neck as he said, "It smells so good." None of this was remotely in character or based on any dialogue in the script, and nothing needed to be said because, again, there was no sound. Mr. Baldoni was caressing Mr. Lively, it's supposed to say Miss Lively, with his mouth in a way that had nothing to do with their roles. But then, in the amended complaint, she says this: during the filming, Mr. Baldoni repeatedly leaned in toward Miss Lively, attempting to kiss her, kissing her forehead, rubbing his face and mouth against her neck, putting his thumb to her mouth and flicking her lower lip, caressing her and telling her how good she smells. None of this took place while Mr. Baldoni was in character as Ryle, because both the intimacy and dialogue departed from what had been agreed to in the script. She also now alleges that she tried to use levity and creative pleas, quote unquote, to deflect the unwanted touching, and that she was trying to do this without antagonizing Mr. Baldoni. And she now references how in the footage she called Baldoni a sociopath as some kind of example of this use of levity. Now, for one thing, personally, in my opinion, these last two things really don't fit with one another, especially if you've watched the actual footage. In this amended complaint, it seems seems to me that she's really trying to squeeze the raw footage into her narrative by saying she's both trying to use levity to get out of this uncomfortable situation without antagonizing Baldoni, but then at the same time, she admits essentially that she called him a sociopath. Typically, when someone calls someone else a sociopath, it's taken as both offensive and antagonistic. And especially seeing how she used the word sociopath in the footage, it's my personal opinion that she really is trying to massage this quite a bit. And in my opinion, it's not working. A jury might disagree, but that's another important point here. She describes what she says the footage shows, and specifically, it says that it shows her discomfort while trying to act for the purposes of filming this movie. But the thing is, if this does in fact go to a jury, no matter how much effort either side puts into in trying to characterize or frame what this raw footage shows, the jurors are going to decide on their own how they characterize it. In other words, the footage is going to speak for itself. So if either side tries too hard to frame this footage and they create an expectation of like what this footage shows that they end up not meeting, remember what I said earlier about juries then starting to discount what these two sides have to say. And now I myself have said that I personally see this footage as a little bit of a muddy scene. The complaint version is inconsistent with what the raw footage shows, in my opinion, and that is helpful for Baldoni. But there is body language that is really tough to decipher precisely because this scene is a blend of acting and being in and out of character. And really, my view on that hasn't changed with Lively's new characterization of this scene in the amended complaint. But not everyone agrees with me. Some people say this absolutely supports Lively, and some people say this absolutely supports Baldoni. And potential jurors are likely to have a similar variety of impressions of this footage as well. But now here's where this change can really end up hurting Lively's case in the long run. To start, can she make these kind of changes so that her allegations are molded more closely to the evidence that has come out? Basically, yes. We are still very early in the litigation, and there is some good latitude that is afforded to a plaintiff that wants to amend their complaint to make new or different or slightly different allegations. That said, there are limits. If changes are so substantive that the court decides that it's what we call a sham pleading, then the court is likely to penalize the plaintiff for it. However, I don't think that we're necessarily in that kind of a situation at this point. And this is a pretty singular downside to Baldoni's team deciding to reveal to the public all of the evidence that they had at such an early stage. They could have instead made the strategic decision to wait to release this footage until Lively was essentially like locked into her complaint past the point where she really could have amended it. In normal litigation, that's what I think a lot of lawyers, maybe even most lawyers, would do in a case like this. But as we all know, this isn't your average lawsuit. It's also a PR battle. So I understand why Baldoni's team released the footage when they did, because it was something that really helped to open up this case to the public for people to start openly and vigorously supporting Baldoni's side. But now Baldoni has to deal with the fact that the amended complaint and the allegations that Lively makes in it essentially replaces the complaint. It's almost as if the complaint, the original one, doesn't exist. Almost. You see, the footage that the jury, hypothetical jury, would end up seeing will now be lined up against the allegations as they're laid out in the amended complaint. But there is a way that I see Baldoni's team using this change to their advantage nonetheless. You see, Blake Lively isn't just the plaintiff in her lawsuit against Baldoni and the other Wayfarer parties. She's also the star witness. And when it comes to witnesses, their credibility is always at issue. And one of the biggest things that juries will look out for when determining a witness's credibility is how consistent or inconsistent they are with what they say happened over time. Now, inconsistencies are not always a death knell for a witness, but if there are enough inconsistencies, and if the context of those inconsistencies suggests that this person didn't just, for example, forget some details, but rather that they're outright lying, the jury is then free to discount basically everything, maybe even disregard everything that a witness says in their testimony. And so here I anticipate that at deposition and at trial, assuming that this case goes that far, Baldoni's lawyers are likely to hammer Lively over the changes that she has made in her story about what happened in this particular scene. This means the details that she changed, the timing of those changes, the fact that the raw footage came out to the public in between those changes to her story, and more. And the thing is, a jury might not take too kindly to Lively's story after hearing all of that if they think that it's because she got caught in a lie early on in this litigation. And what's more, that can impact how much they decide to listen to her, not just on this specific allegation about this specific incident, but on all of her allegations as well. And that can potentially end up sinking her case. Potentially. But those are my thoughts. What do you think? Do you think these changes in her amended complaint will hurt her case? Or do you think this is more or less a big nothing burger? Let us know in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this or at least found it interesting or informative. And if you did, I would love it if you could hit the like button. It does help us with YouTube algorithm gods. And if you're new here and you want to see more coverage of crazy cases and interesting legal topics like this one, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next video is out there. And if you're really enjoying the content and you want to know how to best support the channel, consider becoming a member of Byte Club. You can join either through YouTube memberships or by becoming a supporter on Patreon. Links to both are in the description below. Otherwise, see you in the next one.